Our speaker tonight is Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh, who is a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Bath, and she is also the director of the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. So we have very much got the expert on tonight's subject, which is the lessons from COVID-19 for mobilising climate action. Professor Whitmarsh, take it away.
Thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be here with you this evening, not least because I am a Bishopston resident myself. And so it's just exciting that this group exists, which I didn't know before. So yeah, great to be amongst you all. So yeah, what I wanted to talk about was basically lessons from COVID for mobilising climate action. And just to sort of draw a contrast in some ways between these two issues, these two enormous issues. If you can cast your mind back to the beginning of 2020, seems like a lifetime ago, but these were the sorts of images of the Australian bushfires that were filling our news feeds at the time, as a very poignant reminder of the impacts of climate change on habitats and on, of course, human societies as well. And very recently, we've had images like this of the German floods that have been so devastating. And so increasingly, we're seeing evidence of climate change in terms of a growing number of extreme weather events. And in the last since 2015, we've had the warmest 6 years on record. So things are changing and we're seeing more and more of these sorts of extreme weather events happening. But of course, the other big risk that we've been that has been taking over our lives in the last year and a half has been COVID. And while that has presented a very different type of risk in many ways, one thing that these two risks do have in common are that they require significant behaviour change to address them. Obviously, we've been there have been restrictions which have significantly affected our behaviour, and we've had to stay at home a lot more, and we've had to cover our faces and wash our hands and do lots of other things to stop the spread of COVID. But in the same way, what we do need to do to tackle climate change will increasingly involve a very significant amount of behaviour change. And I think this is beginning to be appreciated by policymakers. Some of the recent analysis by the Committee on Climate Change as part of their 6th carbon budget report quantified the amount of behaviour change required to get to net zero, our climate change target. And they said it was about almost 60%. But actually, that's a rather narrow definition of behaviour change, because it only considers consumer behaviour change. So it's things like buying electric vehicles or heat pumps, maybe a little bit of energy saving, but it doesn't consider professional behaviour change. So actually, the 40% that they say is technological change, there are going to be people that are making decisions about those technologies, about switching away from fossil fuels, for example, making changes in terms of business processes to cut emissions and so on. So actually, in our centre, we say probably the vast majority of the measures needed to get to net zero involve at least some degree of behaviour change. And the sorts of behaviour changes we're talking about include changes to our diet, eating less red meat and dairy, for example, cutting down on food waste, changing our mobility habits to drive and fly less, reducing consumption overall, material consumption, energy consumption, and so on. So pretty big changes to our lifestyle. And one of the other things that COVID and climate change have in common is that the measures to tackle COVID have helped to cut emissions. So in CO2 emissions of about 7 or 8%, mostly due to travel restrictions to do with COVID. So we've been traveling less, so we've been emitting less, and that's been somewhat good for climate change. But in another way, it also shows that we can very significantly change, that governments can mobilise very quickly, that we can change our behaviour very quickly, but that actually there can be a cost to that, because obviously the impact in terms of job losses and how it's affected the economy has not been desirable. There have been many unpleasant side effects of the measures to tackle COVID. And so we want to avoid those while also effectively tackling climate change. So we want to have a planned societal transformation when it comes to tackling climate change. The good news is, or some other good news, I guess, is that actually concern about climate change has been growing in recent years. So in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a very significant increase in concern about climate change in the UK and in other countries. And we were quite surprised that our polling of the UK public showed that concern about climate change actually went up a little bit in 2020. So already in 2019, a significant proportion of the UK public agreed that addressing climate change requires an extremely high level of urgency or a high level of urgency. And those proportions went up as 2020 went on. So now a very significant majority agrees that that is the case. And one of the things I've been involved with was the Climate Assembly UK, which was the National Citizens Assembly on Climate Change. And one of the findings from that was that there was support for a green recovery from COVID, and various polls also bear that out more widely. So it is the case that the public wants to recover from COVID in a way that also addresses climate change. So we're seeing a growing sort of groundswell really of support for taking bold action on climate change. But there are differences that are worth noting between COVID and climate change. They're different in a number of ways. So relative to COVID, climate change is a risk which is probably less tangible and emotive for many people. So if we think about sort of who is being affected, it's often maybe ourselves directly or people very close to us are being affected by COVID, and we see it. It's much more an immediate risk. Whereas for climate change, while there are people that maybe are very concerned about climate change, the impacts of climate change often do feel distant for people. When you ask people, what do you think of when you think of climate change, they will often come up with polar imagery. So for many people, it's something which is a very distant risk. Another difference which is relevant is that tackling COVID is something that people have actually effectively been able to reduce the risk to themselves. So by wearing a mask, by washing your hands, distancing, etc., you can reduce the risk of contracting COVID. Whereas as an individual, if you take steps to reduce your own emissions that cause climate change, you don't necessarily protect yourself in terms of the impacts of climate change. And so there are measures that you can take, to protect your house and things you own from those impacts, but it is harder to directly reduce the risk from climate change than it is the risks from COVID. And I think another relevant difference is that there's a greater social norm to comply with COVID-19 restrictions than there tends to be to lead a low carbon lifestyle. So we just look around us and we've seen that most people are actually staying home when we're asked to stay home, that they are generally wearing masks when they're asked to, or told to wear masks. Whereas it's not really the case that low carbon lifestyles are sort of normal yet, though arguably it's starting to change. So there are things that we can do, measures that can be taken to make climate change more tangible, to increase the sense of self-efficacy and to change social norms, which I'll talk about shortly, so that we can think about climate change in a way that is maybe a little bit more like COVID. And I think other differences are relevant as well, that the solutions to tackling climate change are maybe more ambiguous. We don't sadly have a sort of 3-word motto, hands, space equivalent for climate change, because there are so many things that we need to change. Really, everything has to change. And sometimes it's not even clear which is the better choice between this product and this product, for example. So solutions can be much more ambiguous for climate change, so which makes it harder for people to take action sometimes. I think there's also a lower political mandate to intervene. I think for the reasons here, in some ways, that because many people don't think it's a very immediate and urgent risk, there isn't that political support really for very bold action to intervene, although again I think that's starting to change. And of course the changes required to tackle climate change are likely to be long-term, if not permanent. We need to fundamentally restructure our society, indefinitely, as opposed to just enduring a lockdown for a few months or a bit longer. So that means that you really need that public support for very radical change that is required, and without it, we won't be able to make those changes. So we do need public participation and engagement. And I think that's a really key point I do want to emphasize, actually, is that while we're starting to see a lot more public concern about climate change, that people do support action to take to tackle climate change, I think we need more. We need to grow that. We need to grow the mandate for climate action, because one of the strongest predictors of policy support is how fair people see policies. And part of that fairness is, have I had a say? Is this something which I think is right for society, and how is that going to impact me? How is it going to impact other people? So people want to be able to have a say in policies that affect them. And actually giving people a say does tend to improve the quality of decision making. So I think, the more you can involve people who have lived experience, who have different values and expertise, the better the outcomes tend to be, because you factor in more insights. And as I've mentioned, I think actually having that citizen engagement then allows policymakers to feel they have the political mandate to act. So it empowers them to take those actions because they feel that they are supported and they're being pushed by the public. So we need to do more things like citizens' assemblies, I think. And it's great that Bristol had a sort of citizens assembly, citizens jury that tackled some of the climate change issues as well. So some of these things are starting to filter down to the local level as well. And we need, I think, more of that. And I think linked to this need to make climate change a risk which is more salient and personal for people, something which is an issue that will influence their decision making, we need more effective types of communication. So we need to show why this is an issue that's relevant. And to do that, we need to target people's values. Now, marketeers have been, of course, very good at doing this. They know that by segmenting consumers and targeting and communicating products in different ways, you can appeal to different types of consumers. So you can, if you're trying to market your bottled water, for example, you might say this makes you feel good. So this is sort of something which perhaps for sort of people who don't necessarily care about the environment, but they might want to get some sort of health benefits or whatever, that could be a message that's been a message that's been found to work. But for people who maybe do care about the environment, if your product happens to use less plastic and therefore contributes to reducing landfill, that would be a message that would resonate more with people with greener values, albeit it's still a plastic bottle, I think. So not hugely beneficial, but anyway, so these are findings from kind of marketing studies, and we know that that's really how a lot of advertising works. And the more that we actually try to identify co-benefits from climate action, so sort of side benefits, if you like, sort of additional win-wins for health, for convenience, for finances, for community, the more we're likely to appeal to a broader audience than if we just say, this will tackle climate change. So this has been found in studies where they've done things like closed car parks in an office, which is partly a climate change measure, but when they framed that measure in terms of employees' goals, like this will save you money because you won't spend it on petrol, for example, this will enable you to get more exercise, this will give you more time to read on the bus, that it was significantly more supported than when it was talked about in environmental terms. And so there's actually a really growing body of evidence that the better ways of communicating involve like targeting people's values and highlighting these wider co-benefits. Another way we can use information to kind of bring home the risks of climate change, but also actually start to change norms is through kind of normative messaging. So this is some of the classic studies in social psychology tried to get people to reuse towels in hotel rooms in order to save water and energy. And so in some classic studies, they gave people a standard environmental message in their hotel room, which said, reuse your towel and this will be good for the environment because it will reduce water and energy. And then they compared that message with a norm-based message, which looks something like this. 75% of guests in this hotel usually reuse their towels. And by highlighting the fact that this is what most people do, that was found to be significantly more effective in getting people to reuse their towels than if you just highlight the environmental benefits. So, and this has been shown to work, for example, also in changing people's travel behaviour. So people more willing to travel by sustainable modes if you highlight the fact that people are already doing this amongst your community. Now, I think it's also worth saying that information alone is not hugely effective in changing behaviour. So it is part of, I think, what we need to do to engage people on climate change, show that this is a risk that's relevant in the same way that COVID is relevant to people. But actually, recent reviews show that so-called downstream interventions, so that's broadly speaking information provision, either by labels or giving people feedback on, say, energy meters or using these sort of normative messages I've mentioned, tend to overall change behavior by about 2 or 3%. And they're quite consistent effects. So they do, tend to work if they're designed right, but not to a huge degree. What can be more effective are things like nudges, which you might have come across this term, which broadly means changing the choice architecture. So changing the choices available to us and how relevant they are, how visible they are, and maybe removing some options as well. And these sorts of approaches have been shown to be much more effective than information alone, so about 25% effective overall. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So in a series of studies recently conducted in a UK university, they were trying to get people to eat less meat and dairy. And what they did was they basically increased the number of vegetarian options on the menu in these canteens. That previously had been 1 in 4. They increased that to 2 in 4. So there was still meat options available on the menu, but just by increasing the number of vegetarian options, they increased plant-based sales by between 40 and 80% across these studies, which is pretty impressive considering you're not doing anything in terms of changing prices or removing choice. Another example, which is even more impressive actually, a very recent study by some Swiss researchers in collaboration with a Swiss energy company, and this was with almost 250,000 customers. They looked at the effect of switching people over to a green energy tariff as a default. So as a default, they put all their customers on a renewable energy tariff. And what they found was that even though that tariff was a little bit more expensive than the fossil fuel alternative, around 80 to 90% of customers stuck with that default. Whereas when it had been a fossil fuel default, only 3% had switched over to the green tariff. So a huge increase from 3% to over 80%. And this was an enduring effect as well. So this is because people just don't like the hassle of switching. They just go with defaults. So using those sorts of defaults can be actually very effective for certain sorts of behaviors like that. But there are certain behaviors where it's more difficult to use nudges and these sort of defaults, for example. And transport is one example. So you can't nudge people onto a bus service. You can't nudge people to take the bike instead of driving. You need to much more visibly engage people. And I think part of that is about the sorts of community engagement, participatory engagement I talked about, because we've seen how low traffic neighbourhoods have been quite divisive. And I think it's really important to work with people when you're doing quite radical things like reshaping urban design. But that is exactly what we need to do to change travel behaviours. And so a review of various different approaches to reallocating road space. So in other words, taking road space away from cars and giving it to, say, bicycles and pedestrians. So that includes pedestrianising city centres or putting in bike lanes, but where there was a car lane before. Across all those measures, they reduced traffic by about 22%, but some of them by a great deal more than that. So those sorts of physical infrastructure type measures can be really effective in changing behaviour, as can, of course, economic incentives. They can obviously change the relative attractiveness of taking public transport or walking or cycling relative to driving. One other point I think about interventions and how to change behaviour is that actually you get additive effects if you combine interventions. So this is illustrated by some work that colleagues did looking at reusable coffee cups. So trying to get people to stop using disposable coffee cups by providing information. So this was the sort of posters that they had up in various cafes that they worked with to encourage people to use reusable cups. They had only a 1% increase in people bringing their own cups to the cafes. Whereas when they had this information plus a charge on the disposable cups, plus giving out free reusable coffee cups, they had a 38% increase in people reusing coffee cups. So it really makes a difference, actually, if you try to combine interventions and add several measures at once. And actually, one of the papers from quite a while ago showed that with this works, the differences in the effectiveness of energy conservation interventions across the US varied by a factor of 10, depending on whether there were not just, say, economic measures, but also some of those sort of downstream information type measures I mentioned. So social norm framing, for example. So having a financial incentive plus something like a social norm messaging made a very significant difference to the effectiveness of those programs. So the more things we can kind of throw at it, the better. The final thing to note on behaviour change is around habits. And I think in terms of, and returning to the COVID example, of course, this has been an enormous disruption on our habits, and habits are actually a massive barrier to lifestyle change. So we know that actually, and this is a sort of major area of our research, that we a lot of what we do is sort of on autopilot, that we don't sort of weigh up the pros and cons of different ways of traveling or different sort of things in the supermarket, for example. We are often sort of on autopilot, and habits are a big barrier then to getting people to think about doing different things. But they can be weaker at certain points in time, certain life transitions. So when you move home, when you have a child, when you retire, those are times when your habits are often very disruptive, and your sort of the context changes and you think about doing things differently. And so you're more open to new ways of doing things. And as I'll say in a second, COVID, of course, has been a huge disruption that has weakened our habits. But the evidence from a number of studies now shows that if you intervene at these times, where these moments of change, as we call them, it's usually much more effective than if you try to intervene to change behaviour when people's habits are, in a more stable time, when people's habits are get in the way. So in one study, they gave people some information about their local bus service, and they also gave them a one-day pass to try the bus for free. And they compared people that had moved house in the last 6 weeks, the relocated group, with people that had not recently moved house. And they found that it was only amongst the relocated group that this intervention was effective. It more than doubled bus use, almost to getting up to 50% amongst that group, whereas the intervention just didn't work significantly amongst those who had recently moved house. So it really makes a difference when to intervene. And I think that's one of the things we might also learn about COVID, because we've been tracking people's behaviours over the last year and a bit. And of course, you'll know that lockdown and related measures have significantly disrupted our habits. Of course, we're traveling a lot less for work, for shopping, for other things. We have also, though, been wasting less food. So people have been more using up leftovers, planning meals better, cooking meals from scratch. And so actually spending more time in close proximity to your fridge, I think has partly helped people be aware of when things go off, but they've also not wanted to go to the shops quite so much for fear of catching COVID. So they've kind of eked out food and used up food, leftovers and so on. So there has been a significant drop in food waste. And there have been other changes that we've found. So people saving energy and water, buying less, and spending their time in more lower carbon ways, like gardening, doing creative things and so on. And interestingly, we found a lot of people, the majority of people, have said that at least some of these habits are things that they want to continue to do in the longer term. So there is an intention there that I think we can capitalize on to lock in some of these good habits that have started to form over the last year and a half. But crucially, they need to be locked in. So I've talked about the context being a really important factor in our behavior, that we need to make it easy and convenient and so on for people to do the right things and actually enable them to do that. So the sorts of things that we've had in during COVID, actually the closure of some roads to allow people to more space to walk and cycle, we need to actually have those things put in place in the longer term. So I've gone through kind of a lot, but I wanted to just conclude by saying there is a real need for very significant behaviour change to tackle net zero to tackle climate change and reach net zero in the same way that we've had to very significantly change our behaviour for COVID. What can we learn from COVID to mobilise climate action? Well, we've learnt that radical lifestyle change is possible, but there have been unfortunate, negative side effects, of course, of the lockdown measures and other things to tackle COVID. So we want to achieve significant lifestyle change in a way that doesn't cause massive job losses, for example, and increase disparity between rich and poor, and the other things that we've seen happen. So we need to engage with people to build the social mandate for those policies to tackle climate change. So we need to engage with people to convey the risks of climate change, but also show why there are really positive reasons to take these changes, actually, that it can improve health. Having a low carbon diet and walking and cycling is better for health and well-being, that actually you could save money by some of these measures and so on. So we need to engage with people and explain these various benefits as well. And we need to change the context. We need to implement multiple interventions that build people's sense of self-efficacy, that they can make a difference, and their motivation, that changes social norms so that low carbon living is more normal, so that we can see actually other people are changing, so I should change too, that remove the structural barriers as well, so pricing, urban design, etc. We need a lot of those things, and we really need to get the timing right. So we know that at certain times, when people are forced to do things differently, it can open up the opportunities for people then to see that those alternatives are maybe better. And so when people are starting to say that that is the case from some of the things that they've experienced over the last year or so, albeit there have been many, many negative things, of course, as well, but certain aspects people do want to retain. And I think it's about locking those things in. So I will leave it there, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I know some people tend to shoot off as soon as the speaker has finished, so I'm just going to flash up again our slide with a reminder about all of the wonderful resources we've got on our website. The website link is at the bottom, as is our email address if you want to get in touch about anything. Julie will probably now put another link in the chat box to some of our wilding things. And our PayPal link is in the middle there if you want to help us to continue putting talks like this on. So that's all there for you to have a look at. But we have had a few questions come in so far. If anyone else has got more questions they want to send us, please do stick them in the chat box. I'll start from the top. So so Nikki's question, Lorraine, was surely the thing we've learnt from COVID is that with leadership, when a government explains the risk and tells people clearly what to do, they will do it. Just start explaining that our level of wasteful consumption is not sustainable, but government doesn't want to give that message. Would you tend to agree with that, or is there anything we can do to circumvent a government that doesn't want to say the things that we feel need to be said?
I mean, yeah, there is an element of truth about that. I mean, it is important that we convey the risks of climate change, and that the government is very clear that this is a very serious problem. So yes, we do need that message to be coming out of the mouths of our leaders in a way that it hasn't been so far. But what we know from previous research basically is that just telling people about a risk is not enough to get them to change their behaviour. And there is sometimes a risk that, depending on how you convey that risk, if it seems like something really scary and horrible, people can just switch off and sort of go into denial. So there's this sort of fine balance to be had between conveying the seriousness of the risk and yet saying it's not too late and there are things you can do and here's what you can do. And so building that sense of self-efficacy. So all of the research on kind of health risk communication, for example, getting people to stop smoking and various other sorts of health risks, show that fear messaging often doesn't work. And so you do need to say this is a risk, but you also need to say these are the things that work to tackle it. And crucially, I think you need to frame that in quite a positive way. So I mean, this is talking about these co-benefits, for example, is much more motivating than saying it's all really horrible, even though it is actually all really horrible. But also, life is going to be better if we get it right, in terms of tackling climate change and improving our health and well-being, and potentially creating green jobs and regenerating communities. And so I think focusing on those messages as well is at least as important, if not more so, than highlighting the risks. And I think, as well, as I've shown, information alone doesn't necessarily translate into behaviour change. So even if you've got that message across, you also need to do all those structural things I talked about, like making it easier and cheaper and stuff. So yes, but also other stuff.
Okay. The next question, I've just clarified with Roxanne, because she starts with, I don't know if that's necessarily right. I've just checked and she's basically said that she was responding to Nikki. She thinks it has to be combined. With COVID, it was a risk of harm to self or others and a risk of penalty. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't think you talked as much about penalties as you did incentives in your talk. So do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I think what we know is that generally the public obviously doesn't particularly favour things that remove choice. They don't like taxes and they don't like regulations very much, or sometimes they do. So we have to really work with people to try and explain why we do need to shut down certain choices. And, for example, get people to fly less. And that's a difficult sell to some extent, although people are beginning to accept that that's something that we need to do and that we need to eat less red meat and so on. But yes, we do need to kind of basically change the rules so that it isn't possible to do certain things that we used to be able to do. So that's definitely the case. I think it's just that it's a harder sell than going with some of the positive approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a harder sell, and but I guess actually I'm going to skip ahead to a later question which kind of touched on this again. Where did it go? Jacqueline asks, wasn't the most effective way to get people to stop smoking banning it in public places? Will change happen without laws?
No, we do need the laws, definitely. I mean, I think there's sort of a debate about whether we need to ratchet up the sort of types of policies to tackle climate change in the same way that we did for smoking. So basically, we sort of started off with a bit of information, and there were some campaigns, and there were some support services, and then they put taxes, or huge amounts of tax on cigarettes and stuff. And only after some years did they then ban it in various places, etc., and that role that expanded. So it was a kind of like softer, and then a bit harder, and then like regulation was the last thing that happened. And because people had sort of come around to the idea that this is not acceptable and there are massive risks, and so the norms had started to change, public attitudes had started to change, and therefore it was much easier to get a ban accepted. If you'd started with a ban, it might have just been it would have been incredibly difficult to get that through, basically. So there is an argument for starting softly with kind of climate change stuff and warming people up. And you've probably seen in the last couple of days the government's kind of attempt at encouraging us to just maybe not rinse our plates, and that will be a great way of before you put it in the dishwasher. Well, no, we need to do like so much more than that. But you can sort of see that there's a reason why they're kind of starting with this gentle stuff to warm people up, but we don't have the time, the luxury of time that we arguably did with smoking. We really need to kind of accelerate the pace of change. So I do think we're going to have to move very quickly to regulation, but I think we do need to work with people to engage people, to kind of explain why we need to do these things and what are the trade-offs, and what are the alternatives, basically. Do we want to live in a very dangerous world?
Yes. No, if anyone missed this, I forget exactly who it was. It was a COP spokesperson from the government, someone who basically said, we need to do lots and lots of things, but one thing that might help if we started is if we stop rinsing off our plates and our dishes and things before we put them in the dishwasher. That might be, don't do that. That's a waste of water and power and everything. And I was like, oh, it's so nice to be back in the early 2000s again. I'm going to go and buy a iPod. I read that and I just kind of thought, yes, but also, can we talk about, I found that all very strange. So Grant makes an interesting, potentially contentious point. Grant, I didn't know you were so radical. Wasteful consumption is a very significant chunk of the economy, and the government are more concerned by risks to growth than they are by climate. We need to lobby them to deploy normative messaging to target values, to speak of societal benefits. It's a big idea. I don't know what to say. You're probably right, but it's definitely going to be controversial. I don't know if you wanted to say anything to that, Lorraine.
I agree. I think like the obsession with growth has been obviously really detrimental to genuine like societal well-being. So I think there are sometimes encouraging signs that maybe they're thinking about different indicators to judge the progress of society, but then they don't really seem to kind of come to fruition. But so I do agree, but I do think that also, it is about different political values. And so we found that how to engage with those with more right of centre values, more kind of conservative values, is to try and align the messages with those values in some way. So yes, we probably also need to change values, I agree. But in the immediate term, because I think that's a project that takes a very long time, we need to work with people's values. And so it is about saying, in order to tackle climate change, we need to shift away from consumption of material goods that are very disposable, and this kind of linear material economy, to a more circular material economy that's where we're reusing things, we're sharing things, and that there is money to be made in the sharing economy. So it's not about putting people out of business and closing, it might be about closing sectors of the economy, but it's also about opening new sectors of the economy, so that we're moving away from a sort of disposable kind of products to more durable things. And then there will be jobs in repairs and rental, and so changing the nature of the economy. So I feel like that might be potentially palatable at some point, as opposed to just saying you can't have growth, which it may be true, but it's just a bit of a harder sell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This question made me laugh a little bit, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think it's an interesting one. Julie asks, what would be the top 3 things you would do if you were suddenly installed as Dictator of Britain?
Well, that's terrifying, isn't it? Oh God. Well, I'd resign, obviously, straight away, because I wouldn't want to be a dictator. But I would, oh, well, some of the nudge stuff is like just really quick wins. So like I'd go with the quick wins, basically. So I would, basically say that all public sector catering has to have at least 50%, but ideally like 75% plant-based options on the menus. And we know that would have a massive effect, like overnight. I would say that companies would have to disclose the impacts of their products on the climate, like so carbon disclosure type stuff, like you actually have to say, and that would hopefully, it's not going to, it's not necessarily going to have a massive impact on consumers, but within industry, hopefully there would be a bit more kind of, oh, we've actually got to say that we're completely destroying the planet. So that is likely to have some effect. Do I have to do three? And I'd do more like, I do more road reallocation, like reallocating road space away from cars to walking and cycling, but do it in a way that didn't make people too cross. So I'd engage with communities while I did it. But I think that would have a massive effect.
Very good. I thought you were going to say something on the lines of, "Oh, well, I would never want to be a dictator. I want people.
Obviously,
I want
I
to bring
wouldn't.
people with me. I want to change norms and values and things, and just reject the question out of hand." But interesting to know that you thought about what it would be like to be a dictator. I've got to no. I'm gonna move on because we could stay here all day, and we've actually getting lots of really interesting questions. And I want to try and wrap this up by around 8:30 if we can. Yes, so a few people just saying how interesting your talk was, as well as needing to stop outputting loads of carbon, we also need to draw it down. Is a different approach needed to get people and organizations to change their behavior to do the latter as opposed to the former?
Oh, what, storing carbon, absorb,
Yeah.
like negative emission stuff? Well, I guess some of this is transferable. So, there is quite a strong reliance on sort of negative emission technologies actually in government plans and in the Committee on Climate Change's advice, because they've assumed that people will not be willing to radically change their lifestyles. So we are potentially going to see quite a lot more of this, and some of it's about planting trees and some of it's about new technologies that kind of absorb carbon emissions and things like that, some of which is not particularly well tested yet. So we are going to potentially see some of that, but I do think it is important, like the engagement side is still important here, because those things are likely to cost money. So we're going to see it coming through maybe our energy bills if this is the way we go. So it's not going to be something that isn't going to affect us. It just may mean that we don't have to change our lifestyle particularly, but we will see costs. There could be risks. There could be risks to the environment. There could be risks to health and other things that we don't know about. So I think having a debate about how much of this kind of negative emissions that we want to have it is absolutely crucial, because it is going to impact us at least in some way. And even if we just go in a more green nature-based solutions type way, like planting more trees and things, which is popular, it will have, it will completely change the landscape of the country. So, and there may be less space to grow food and things like that. So we do need to kind of think about all those implications and talk to people about it, talk to voters who will be impacted by this. So partly it's the same thing.
No, absolutely. I think from my work with Bristol charity Avon Needs Trees, I can tell you that the number of obstacles to getting trees planted are vast and varied. And some people are going to have to put up with a slightly obscured view if they want to avert catastrophe. So the next one, I think this one is possibly a bit more of a comment. The rhetoric of the government, I think this is around COVID, was to make short-term sacrifices now so that we could gain our freedom back, freedom to go out and consume. I think the key point is to make the need for change relevant and appealing to each and every one of us as fundamentally selfish, social, and perhaps a bit lazy human beings. Not all of us are willing to act on moral grounds or even able to. It is a privilege. I don't think I think that makes sense to me.
Agree.
Yeah. Great. This is a question I'm really interested to know your thoughts on, actually. This is a question from Sue. Does Lorraine think that the names that we give our action groups, such as Extinction Rebellion, West Bristol Climate Action, etc., could those names actually be hindering people from getting involved who are not necessarily passionate about the environment? And should we be targeting those people more when we name our groups?
Interesting question. Well, maybe, but it also, you want to, I suppose, gather together people who are like-minded to also to share, share experiences and insight and give support and so on. So on the one hand, you want to be transparent about what your interests are so that you gather together like-minded people. But so maybe it's fine to name your group that and be clear about what you're passionate about and what your objective is. But when you're engaging beyond that group, I think using language that is recognizes that not everybody is as passionate about climate change action as you is important. So, so that you don't sort of assume that talking about emission reductions is going to be something that anybody cares about. That actually maybe highlighting health benefits and convenience and other things will be things that will resonate a bit more. So I suspect it's fine to name your group what you are. But yeah, just use different language when you're engaging with others, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we've just gone through a whole rebranding and merger and everything. We are not changing it now. It was too long a process. We've registered the website domain. We're not changing it now. But it's a good point, Sue. And yeah, definitely thank you for raising it. I think it's a really interesting question. Are the measures you've suggested enough to avert catastrophe? An article in The Guardian yesterday said that unless China, Russia, Brazil, and Australia agree to stop burning fossil fuels, the Earth will become 5 degrees hotter. Also, shouldn't we cut our meat and dairy altogether and stop livestock farming? Yes, obviously, eventually, depending on whose model you look at, we will need some pretty radical changes. But I think your point, Lorraine, is that you're starting with the easy stuff. So that we can hopefully build up to the changes that become necessary. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is sometimes difficult to, I mean, it can be really disheartening, can't it, when you sort of see that stuff about big countries potentially not doing enough. But I think, there are encouraging signs that countries are generally sort of taking steps, not enough yet, definitely not. But, maybe COP later this year will move things forward. There have been more ambitious commitments made since G7. So, things are starting to change a little bit. But yeah, no, absolutely. Countries need to do way more. But I think it's also interesting what's happening. In some ways, grassroots are really just pushing, like they are at the forefront of action. And so I think, and part of that is, I think, there are so many of these other benefits. So even if you just sort of think like, oh my God, like nobody else is doing anything on climate change, but actually what the hell, I want to make this community much nicer and greener and cleaner and everything. So lots of local action and subnational action is happening all over the place. So even if it seems like countries are not necessarily doing a lot, loads is happening at the subnational level to be aware of. And yeah, well, the thing about the meat, I suppose, is according to the Committee on Climate Change, we only need to reduce our red meat consumption by 20% in the next 9 years, I think, and then maybe as 30 or 40%, I think, after that, which is quite, and the trend is going in that direction anyway. So that's not even with very much government intervention, we'll probably do that. But I do think, yeah, we do need to, like, if we actually definitely want to mitigate climate change, we'd probably want to be a bit more ambitious. And if we didn't want to rely on those negative emission technologies, which, as I mentioned, are kind of a bit untested and risky, we'd want to be a bit more ambitious and to cash in on those health benefits, because a low carbon diet is a much healthier diet. So yeah, I think, but it's also about not scaring people off, because we are definitely seeing people much more willing to cut down on red meat consumption, a bit less so on the dairy. And personally, I do like cheese. So until they found a decent vegan alternative to cheese, like they haven't invented it yet, I'll keep trying it, but I'm not convinced yet. And I feel bad saying that, but I'm not alone.
No, vegan cheese is a very mixed bag. Yeah, it's generally it's quite bad. I agree. And I wish it weren't. I'm similar to you. On the farming and things, I'm just going to use this as an excuse to give a plug to our last talk, which was on regenerative agriculture. If you've got questions about livestock farming, meat, dairy, all those kinds of things, head on YouTube or onto our website. You can see the link at the bottom. If you go to our website, you'll find the page on events, videos of past events. I think it's up there. Or go to our YouTube channel and find the talk on regenerative agriculture. That might give you a bit more hope that you won't have to give up all meat and still be able to combat climate change. Julie asked a question about public sector food and whether that would be a thing. Somebody else replied about meat-free Mondays. Julie was asking whether there was a campaign going for more meat, plant-based options. Yeah, meat-free Mondays would be a good one to look out for. And if anyone knows any more, stick them in the chat. More people telling you that your talk was interesting. The information that is available to the public on climate change is improving with many organizations, e.g. the Met Office is starting twice monthly newsletters on climate change, and local government and organizations are working on ways of communicating climate risks to the public in ways that provide the information to empower people to make changes that can reduce impact on the environment. And that's all great, but I think your point, Lorraine, was that information on its own is not enough.
Indeed. Yeah, no, it is good that there's more and more information available. I think I can't remember if I really said this, but it is the case that the public knows about the impact of travel choices and energy use in the home on causes of climate change, but there's very little awareness, for example, of the role of dietary choices, that there's or indeed of embedded emissions within other products. So there are information gaps, and so information is important to tell people what they can effectively do to tackle climate change if they would like to do that. But yeah, by itself, it often doesn't translate into behavior because there are barriers, because even with the best will in the world, you don't, maybe it's just too expensive, or there's no good vegan cheese.
We're coming up on 8:30. There's a couple of really interesting questions left. So I think what I'm going to say is, if it's okay with Lorraine, we'll stick around for another 5, maybe 10 minutes if they're really interesting questions. I don't think it'll take another 10 minutes. Let's go for around 5. But I would really like to ask you these. So if everyone's okay to stick around for just a little bit longer, we will do that. And unless you've got a really hot burning question that you want to stick in the box right now, probably send it to us in an email or something. But Grant had a follow-up to his point from earlier, which was that the government's obsession with growth, wasteful consumption, being a big chunk of the economy, does fund a lot of important public services and provide a lot of employment. The solution to the gap caused when behavior change hopefully ends wasteful consumption will be to fairly tax the super rich, requires multilateral cooperation, and with Biden and the EU, there are belated promising signs. So reasons to be mildly optimistic there. But yeah, I want to get to the questions. So Sue asked another good one. How would you persuade people that uncut verges, i.e. sort of grassy areas being left to regrow and rewild, aren't messy, but are actually good for the biodiversity of the area? What kind of methods could we use to convince people they need more of those in their lives?
Oh, good question. Because we had something like that with the wonky veg, didn't we? And I think there was sort of a bit of an awareness campaign around, actually, you are being massively wasteful if you, and supermarkets are, by throwing away the wonky veg. So there is something probably about like just a knowledge gap, actually, that might potentially exist here in the same way, that people just actually don't realize that it is about biodiversity, that there are biodiversity benefits to not cutting them. So I mean, partly an information campaign, actually, but I mean, information is generally better conveyed when it is by somebody who you trust and who shares your values, and in a way that is sort of compelling and resonates with what you care about. So Hey, I know, maybe that it will reduce our council tax if the council is not cutting the verges so much, don't know. But people do actually care quite a lot about biodiversity. In our surveys, it comes really high in terms of, like, I mean, whether it's a David Attenborough effect, but just generally like wildlife biodiversity and protecting the environment comes a little bit higher than climate change, and that's already pretty high. So I think it might not even need massively reframing to just highlight this is a really good idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, thanks, Lorraine. I hope, Julie, you can use some of that. This is a really interesting one. Emma asks, are there any countries or cities which countries or cities have seen the most successful environmental sustainability behavior change campaigns? Can we give any specific examples? And can you draw any conclusions whether the national or cultural characteristics have an impact? I've got one in mind, but I'd like to know if you've got any examples you can think of.
Oh, I'd like to hear yours. Well, we're doing a review at the moment, actually. So I don't have a complete or very up-to-date answer. But when we've looked at transport policies in the past, like there's been cities like Freiburg and I think Malmo, and so it tends to be a few cities in Germany and Scandinavia kind of are doing quite well in these areas. Actually, yeah, so recently Malmo we identified as quite a progressive city, that's in Sweden, where they've done quite loads on both adapting to climate change and mitigating climate change, and done it in terms of benefits as well to biodiversity, to gender equality, and so on. So Malmo is an example. Milan is starting to do quite a lot as well. And then there are a few sort of isolated examples, like, I mean, Paris is doing a few things and stuff. So there's a website, there's a network called PCAN, which recently did a report on UK cities which are doing a lot on climate change. I can put the link in the chat in a minute, but yeah, so they did a review and identified a few places, and I think like maybe Manchester, I think Bristol was one of the good ones. But anyway, so I don't, sorry, bit of a partial response. Story, what's yours, Dorian?
Yeah, no, you actually mentioned it. I think I'm taking this from a talk we had on livable neighborhoods, and which I think should still be available online on our YouTube channel and things. But I think Paris was held up as a good example of this, maybe not more broadly than livable neighborhoods and things, but in the sense that the council or whoever it was making the decisions just went, we're doing it, you're coming with us. They didn't actually worry quite so much about, making the case and getting everyone on side. They just made the changes and then found that people kind of liked them. Once they were there, once they were in front of them and they were like, oh, I guess I can use my bike down there now, or maybe I will get a bike now that it's really easy to get into the center of Paris. I believe I've got that right. Someone please put a comment if I've got that mixed up with somewhere else. But yes, please, if you'd like to know more about that, specifically with livable neighborhoods and things, do go and check out the talk. Certain boroughs, I know Waltham Forest in London is held up as a great example of livable neighborhoods being very successful. And yeah, the sad fact is, many of us live in Bristol. We're kind of on the good end. If you look around you and think, God, I wish this place were greener, imagine living anywhere else. We're doing quite well on a relative scale. But of course, there's still so much more we can do, and we should do. We've got a couple more, and then I do want to wrap this up. I think that one's more of a comment, so I'm going to skip on that. Lorraine, would you be happy to share your slides with people who would like to see them? Okay, if anyone would like a copy of Lorraine's slides, and this video will be going on YouTube very soon, so if you just want to re-watch the presentation, you can do that. But if you'd like a copy of the slides, send us an email to the address at the bottom of your screen. I'll contact Lorraine and I'll get them sent over to you. No problem. Yeah, Amsterdam, Utrecht, and Copenhagen have done great with cycling. I mean, Amsterdam's been great with cycling since for a very long time. Too good, almost. It's crazy. That's quite a Go on, let's have a go at this. Why is there so much climate denial in places that are hit hard by extreme weather events like wildfires or floods? How do we make people accept that this is reality and it's only going to get worse? Our brain seems wired to deny or ignore the threat, as you said, very different from the immediate threat of COVID. Yes, how do you convince someone whose house has been flooded that the flood was caused or, was exacerbated by climate change? Is there a way to do that?
We did some work on climate skepticism actually, and it's primarily predicted by political ideology. So people on the far right of centre politically are the most likely to be skeptical, and you can see it in a most pronounced way in the States, where depending on which party you vote for, you're more or less likely to believe in climate change and be concerned about it. Although the gap is narrowing, so people are, it's a bit less politically polarized than it used to be, and that's also the case in this country. It used to be the case that Conservative voters were much more skeptical, but that people are sort of, the gap is narrowing, I think, there. But what we also found was that if you try to tell people who are skeptical about climate change, about the risks of climate change, and even in ways that are quite relevant to them, they just sort of say this is nonsense. And
it's past 9, you can say bollocks.
I was going to go with bullshit, but okay.
Oh yeah, both work.
Yeah, and they just ignore you and so it is virtually impossible to actually convert a skeptic. So what you have to do is think, what is it I want this person to do? And it may be that you want them to save energy or possibly even protect themselves, but whatever you want them to do, you have to frame that action in a way that resonates more with what they do care about. And so if they're on the sort of right of centre, it might be about kind of like energy security, so that we don't have to have imports from other places overseas, and it might be about kind of green jobs, and it might be about affordability, and it might be about regenerating your community. Actually, that's something that does resonate across the political spectrum. We also found that talking about being not being wasteful resonated across the political spectrum, actually. So there are ways of talking that engage with people, whoever they are, but often you just have to not talk about climate change if they really are not sold on the idea of climate change. So it's but you can talk about flooding. I mean, if you're trying to engage flooded communities with taking action on flooding, talk about the flood that you're in. Don't talk about climate change, just talk about flooding in your community.
Okay. Yeah, no, really interesting points there. Yeah, I think yeah, that's really good points in there. I think we're out of questions, but someone has just posted, Grant has just said, further to Emma's question, a big shout out to Bristol, who recently became only the second city in the UK to be awarded gold status as a sustainable food city. And Caroline has put Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Bristol. So I don't know if there's different comparison sites vary. But yes, that's going to be the end of our talk. Thank you hugely to Dr. Lorraine Whitmarsh for coming to speak to us tonight. Thank you to all of you for coming and listening. Please do check out the website, check out our PayPal link, our videos, and if you haven't joined the mailing list, please, you can go to the website, go to the contact page, and just join the mailing list so we can let you know about other talks we've got coming up and all sorts of other wonderful things.